Welcome back to the channel. Sorry I didn't have a video yesterday. It's actually been pretty crazy here at my house. All the kids are sick once again. We've got a birthday coming up and, well, Daddy had to do Daddy things. So I'm back here to talk about comic books and, you know, another day, another depressing story. Imagine this. You're an actual leader in your company. You drop sales basically across the line. You have one premier brand and you've started to kill sales on that. There is no enthusiasm for your brand. What do you think would happen to you? You and I both know you would get reprimanded. You better turn this around or else. And if it had been too long, you would likely be fired. But in the comic book industry, that kind of incompetence, that kind of abject failure actually gets you promoted in comic books. Jim Lee, the superstar artist turned publisher of DC, has added the title of president to his growing list of executive designations. Jim Lee, re-upping his deal with DC, has been promoted to president as well as publisher and chief creative officer of the comic book company, which is a part of Warner Brothers Discovery. We do know that Warner Brothers Discovery has looked into DC Comics, and they know the sales are bad, and they know that the revenues are declining under Jim Lee and his leadership. But obviously, it wasn't all that important. Kind of sucks being a comic book fan where you would hope there would eventually be that silver lining, that change in leadership, that hope that things could actually get better at DC Comics and then maybe even better at Marvel Comics. Sales of DC Comics are pretty much down across the board. I've been documenting that here on the channel for like the last 2 years. It's insane what's been going on with DC Comics. The amount of comic books they publish that are basically dead before they ever hit the shelves because there's no interest in the brand at this moment. I've talked to comic book shops. It's not just the sales on Comic Hub that back this up. Comic book shop owners have also noticed no interest in DC Comics at this moment other than Batman. And we've also seen interest in Batman, the premier character in all of American comic books, actually are starting to decline as well. Under Jim Lee, he had the just genius idea. What if we made every single comic book that we publish Batman? Some months, over 50% of all DC Comics published were Batman or Batman related, a Batman character starring in a comic book. And now we see that kind of overexposure killing sales on Batman. What do you do when you actually kill off your brand and the flagship of your brand? You get promoted to president, and he's also the chief creative officer of all DC Comics. When has DC Comics had any good creative lately? I would say The Flash has been very good, and that's really the only series that's tied into other things going on in DC Comics that I think has been a success over the last 18 months. I would say Batman Superman World's Finest has also been very good. Not exactly tied in to the bigger comings and goings of DC Comics. It's kind of like its own little thing sitting over there in the corner. Otherwise, not a whole lot good going on at DC Comics at the moment. So it's not like there's been a great creative renaissance under Jim Lee as the chief creative officer. Like maybe people didn't even realize how good DC Comics were right now. There was lack of interest, but the quality was actually there. There's no interest and there's no quality across the board. Of course, he would get promoted to president of DC Comics, which means likely Jim Lee not only got a promotion as far as his title, but is actually getting more money, getting paid more to fail harder at DC Comics. This is the most insane industry I've ever seen in my life. You can't fail this much in government, and you can fail in government a lot. Let me put it that way. We have some more information. Lee will continue in his primary role as publisher at DC, where he leads the creative teams. He will also continue to lead the creative efforts to integrate DC's publishing portfolio of characters and stories across all media, supporting the brands and studios of Warner Brothers Discovery. Under Lee's leadership, DC also successfully launched same-day digital comics through DC Universe Infinite, the company's digital subscription service, and made it a priority to concentrate on international marketplaces. There are quite a few things to unpack there, and I'm going to talk about all of them. But Jim Lee has had under his primary duties for quite some time as like the DC character guy. It doesn't matter if you're making a video game, a TV show, a movie, a comic book. It's Jim Lee's job to make sure that the DC characters are portrayed correctly throughout all mediums, and there's some type of synergy to where people that see Batman on the big screen see Batman in the video games, see Batman in graphic novels, see Batman in comic books, and it's basically the same character. Could you actually, with a straight face, mind you, say that Jim Lee has done a good job with that? I would say the portrayal of DC Comics pretty much across the board has been erratic at best, and for the most part has been detrimental to the long-term success and viability of the characters that DC Comics owns. Look at Gotham Knights, the latest thing to come out under the watchful eye of Jim Lee. That is one of the worst shows we've ever seen. And before that, we had Titans. We've all been waiting to see Dick Grayson, right? Want to see him in a TV show. We get Titans. Absolute, utter dog shit. One of the worst portrayals of Dick Grayson I've ever seen in my life. Also, a terrible portrayal of Jason Todd. Some of the more marketable characters that DC Comics just owns. So I would say he's doing a pretty not bang up job on that front. And then as far as he's emphasized digital comic books, sales of digital comics for DC, Marvel, Image, basically across the board plummeted in 2022 as he prioritizes digital comics. The man has the dumbest digital strategy in the world outside of Distillery. Yeah, let's charge $11 for a digital comic book subscription platform. Let's make it more expensive than Netflix for comic books. And let's not do same day release, as they said in the article there. I believe it's a 30-day later release, and you actually have to pay more than that. And then they say he's concentrating on international marketplaces. What have they done to concentrate on international marketplaces other than that Batman comic book that had a bunch of stories from writers from around the world? Other than that, I can't think of a single thing that DC Comics has done to concentrate on international marketplaces at all. I actually happen to live outside of the United States of America in an international marketplace, which also happens to be a hotbed for comic book talent. The Philippines. DC Comics aren't any more accessible today here in the Philippines than they were the day that Jim Lee basically took over as the man in charge when Dan Didio got fired. I can't believe that things got worse under Jim Lee when Dan Didio left. Dan Didio, who's one of the dumbest creative minds in comic book history, just could not take the W for the life of him. If there was a win to be had and he didn't come up with it, he would just blow everything up because he was an absolute idiot. But he was a better leader than Jim Lee. He was a better businessman than Jim Lee. He didn't run off nearly the amount of fan base that Jim Lee has done as the leader of DC Comics. And of course, now he's the president. Because this is upside down world, it's strange world or whatever, that we're living here in comic books. You can't take this stuff seriously. According to the Hollywood Reporter, Jim Lee has been a reassuring presence at DC as the company has navigated choppy corporate waters that would have given even Aquaman shivers. As one of the heads of DC, Lee has seen a succession of owners from Time Warner to AT&T and Discovery, with various mandates pushing the company one way or another. He has seen the film media side of DC explode in importance, but has also seen its share of upheavals in recent years. His promotion is seen as a through line in the Warner Brothers Discovery era and the nascent DC studios under James Gunn and Peter Safran. There's no denying that since Jim Lee has been in charge, there's been a tremendous amount of change for DC Comics. And every time your company moves into another company, somebody else is in charge and they have different priorities. And then you get the bloodbaths, right? He lost his editorial staff. They lost like 150 years of experience as far as executives that were shown the door during Jim Lee's time being in charge there. So yes, he hasn't had it the easiest. There's no denying that. But the key to being a good leader is taking the resources that you do have and making the most of them. Jim Lee, as a leader, really hasn't done anything to make any of these characters more important than the day he took over. Jim Lee, as far as I can tell, hasn't done anything to address the quality issues at DC Comics. Jim Lee continues hiring idiots. Jim Lee continues greenlighting just catastrophic ideas for these characters. Just think about what's happened to Tim Drake. Think about what's happened to John Kent. Think about what's happened to Wally West under the watchful eye of Jim Lee. And tell me, just try and tell me that he deserves a promotion out of all this. This dude deserved to be fired at least 2 years ago. And it's another reason that I just don't have a lot of confidence in James Gunn as the leader of DC Studios. He actually thinks what Jim Lee is doing in comic books is a good job. This guy read Tom King in DC comic books and said, you know what? This guy wrote the most influential, greatest Supergirl story in the history of the world, and we need to make Tom King the destroyer of DC Comics along with Jim Lee one of the focal points of the publisher itself. I'm starting to think that James Gunn, he might have an eye for a really good soundtrack. he might be able to write a really good joke. And hell, he's certainly got some style when it comes to directing. But when it comes to identifying talent, seeing what's working and what's not working, I don't think he's got the first fucking clue about any of that stuff. But we always knew DC Comics aren't important. If they were important, Jim Lee would have been fired a long time ago. They've looked at the books. They know they're failing left and right, but there just isn't enough revenue potential because I guess they don't see that DC Comics could become the next Shonen Jump. They don't understand that DC Comics, American comics, could be just as hot as manga right now if they pull their heads directly out of their asses where they've been residing, I don't know, for the last 8 or 9 years or so. And I've talked about this a lot on the channel, and it all starts with leadership. I've mentioned that quite a few times in this video. And I talked about it, I don't know, 3 years ago, about how DC and Marvel would never improve until Jim Lee and Cebulski actually became leaders, which they're not. If you haven't seen this video, definitely check it out right now. There's also a link in the video description.